to Varn Blog, and today I'm talking to the third of four members of the Regrettable Century podcast, and frenemy of the show. Actually, not really frenemy. Frenemy is reserved for people like Doug Lane. I'm going to leave that in. I would say, Kevin, you and I have had a long dialogue where you were way more optimistic than me. And on a recent, I've listened now to all the 5-year plan episodes of the Regrettable Century. So you guys over there at Regrettable at the end of the year go through and do your year in review. And you are the least black-pilled, to use the colloquial of said Regrettable Century, and you tend to be more optimistic than me. But I have seen a very substantive shift in your politics in the last 5 years. And then listening to these shows, I listened to year 5 first, and I went back and listened to all of them, going through the archives, and I did see a pretty profound shift in your politics, and yet you are the only member of the Regrettable Century collective hosterdom. I don't know how to. The general executive board of the non-party, of 4, which, hey, it's probably larger than some track groups these days.
That's true.
Who is still in the DSA, and I wanted to talk to you about the kind of profound shifts in the DSA in the last year, because I think you view them slightly more optimistically than I do, but actually I see some of the same things you do, and I wanted to talk about the kind of, for lack of a better word, dialectical tension in a lot of these movements, because I think there is a space where some people in these organizations could really learn something right now in a way that they probably couldn't a year ago. Mm-hmm. And the question is, for me, what is going to be conditions that are optimal for them to learn something? Because that's going to be...
I think that is the right question. I think, right. So just to sort of top level frame my own position on it, mm-hmm. I would say that so Chris has talked about DSA at this point being a whale fall, where it was potentially like a large growing organism, and now it's a teeming ecosystem that's thriving on the carcass remains of what used to be a large growing, thriving organism. And so that's the signs of life that we see currently, is that sort of that very temporary ecosystem feeding on the corpse. And it's soon to be no more. I don't think that that's necessarily wrong. And I don't have a counter metaphor necessarily in mind to propose. But what I would say is I don't think that that's guaranteed. And even if it is guaranteed, I think that the best hopes for pivoting into something worth having will come from organizing the best elements of DSA into whatever comes after it, even if it is a dead on arrival currently. So I suppose when I speak up in defense of DSA or sound optimistic about it, I don't want to overstate that optimism in the sense of presenting myself as thinking that DSA is assured or even probably going to be successful or a useful, good, productive use of any of our time or energy in the future. But rather that there is at least a kernel of hope in there, and I don't know what else to do.
Well, it's interesting to me to think about this a little bit. Let's focus in on the figure of Bernie Sanders, because finally there's been a realization of the implications of some of Bernie Sanders' international politics. Now,
Right.
I think those international politics have been the same since like 1984.
Oh yeah.
Like, they're remarkably consistent. He's always been iffy on anti-Zionism. He
Oh yeah.
has flirted with supporting radicalish movements abroad, but always stepped back. I mean, ask him about his relationship to the Sandinistas to this day, and he'll start sputtering and get mad at you for asking the question. And that, that is not something. Weirdly, it's only centrist who point that out, but I've always thought that was an interesting development. Like, we just don't talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
His relationship to the military-industrial complex got him in trouble with the more radical end of the Vermont left, which admittedly was Bookchanites in the 80s, but still. In the 80s, and there's also a thing that I think Chris Catrone is right about, is Bernie actually is a representative, not of one generation back, but two. I mean, he is basically the last remnant of the reformist end of the New Left, that's young enough to still be alive.
Yeah.
Like,
I think that's true. I don't think he was ever. I don't. Well, anybody who entered the Bernie moment with their eyes open, I think, with clear head, I don't think regarded Bernie as a figurehead in the sense that we think of, cult leaders or, great leaders of parties or something. He wasn't Chavez. He wasn't the figure who was carrying carrying the party to the left. I think he was an opportunity. He was a moment. He embodied a real something that was actually existing and not just in our imaginations, but something that was a real possibility with an actual break with the world spirit at the moment, that proposed to us the opportunity to go down a different road in a different path. And we could talk about we could harness that moment to the best of our abilities, or we could just sit on the sidelines and lecture everybody else for their imperfections. And I think the right thing to do in that moment was to ride that, ride that wave.
I was of two minds about that. I was very much of the lecturing people for their imperfections in 2016. Although,
Varn, I am shocked to hear that you would do something like that.
Well, the funny thing for me was that 2016, ironically, illustrated to me that it was a substantive break, because my initial response was just like, and somewhat of my defense, I was not on the ground in the United States, but I'm like, I've heard this before. I was in the Gravel campaign. I remember the Kucinich campaign. I remember, like, I'm old. I remembered the Jesse Jackson campaign, which is analogous to it, actually.
That one I think is more analogous, yeah.
But my initial response from my seat at the time in Egypt was just like, well, this is going to be probably bigger than Gravel or Kucinich, but not a lot. And it ended up being huge. The irony for me is when I moved on to the team, like, well, okay, let's see where we can dialectically push this, because we know it's going to hit a wall, and people will get mad at me for saying that. But I'm like, we should endorse it. We should go along with it, but it's going to hit a wall.
Yeah.
And
that's the point. That's the whole point of our forgive me if I keep interrupting you.
No, go ahead.
That's the whole. I think that's like the whole point of the Regrettable Centuries harping on about dialectical pessimism. Is the whole point of this is not to be black-pilled cynics, but rather to say that we are going to hit a wall in our best hopes and our best possible moments. we're going to hit a wall, so let's plan for and prepare for it. Let's enter into anything that we enter into with eyes wide open and be aware of what the fuck we're doing.
Yeah, and I think for me, the Bernie moment, the 2020 Bernie moment was an hour maneuver flying at dusk. So I was not really here to feel the energy in 2016. I did feel the energy, legitimately feel the energy in 2020, but ironically, I do think there's something to the critique of Bernieism that by 2020, even if he never, really truly joined the Democratic Party, that he had lost some of the appeal, not all, but some of the appeal as an outsider to this system. In other words, like that break with the movement of history that he represented in the left, even if it was a callback to an older left, was real, but also already being recuperated in the likes of people like I would say the more opportunistic end of the squad. Like, I mean, we'll give Rashida Tlaib credit, and to a lesser degree, Han Omar credit for being consistent in ways that have been punished. But like, those were not the two people were initially super hopeful in. It was Ocasio-Cortez. It was, to a lesser degree, Cory Bush. In a very strange way, I felt like we were realizing the truth of 2016 for someone like me was actually something that I saw only in its dissolution in 2019, 2020. But that led me in an interesting scenario because I just want to talk about like what I can figure out from the objective numbers of the DSA, which the DSA used to be very good at being open about. They are not anymore for obvious reasons. You can kind of figure it out if you look at like insider documents that are not hidden, but they do not advertise.
There are people in leadership who are all about like openness, and if you find that what they convey about their access to internal numbers or whatever, which they do, but they don't get like spread around and publicized or collated into graphs and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. So you can find it. It does exist. Just like I found, it took me forever to find it, but I found like what percentage of dues go where. Like DSA is actually a somewhat transparent organization for a left organization. Frankly, that's one of the huge frustrations about left organizations. Is like you see one and you're like, no one even knows how many members you have. It might be 5, it might be 5,000. We have no idea. That's not true for the DSA, but
trying to operate like the Bolsheviks who were operating under Tsarist Russia and robbing banks to fund themselves, or robbing trains or whatever to fund themselves. Like we're not in those conditions, guys. We have freedom of speech.
I mean, it is funny because when you read like what Marx suggests you do wear, like Bolshevik style cells, there's not something Marx would have forbidden, but he's very much like when you can be open, like in Switzerland was always his example at the time, you should do so. Right. And I'm like, we can be open. Like, like look, it's not like the clandestine groups aren't swarming with feds anyway. So like it's just you might as well. But the DSA will still claim to have almost 100,000 members. And what was interesting about that in the context of 2019 is they grew. God, it felt like they were growing exponentially for a while. Because when I started following them in the first inbreeding campaign, we went from, they had 5,000 members effectively. That was largely a New York State political group that had achieved things in the 80s of significance, actually. That was frozen at that 5,000 level for 30 years. Then the Jacobin reading groups start, just to recount the history for people who are a little bit younger. After Occupy, people are frustrated with the Graeberite end of Occupy stagnation. and you start seeing this build. And so you start seeing there's debates in the larger left about where should we go now that these sectarian organizations are dying. And by that, we saw the ISO fall apart. But people could see this cracking after Occupy, like the way the old sectarian left of the 90s couldn't really deal with Occupy was another indication that there was something new coming. You saw Socialist Alternative being exported from, the UK here, explode in your region actually, and then quickly die off because they couldn't figure out how to handle
splintered and
basically how to handle the Bernie moment, and how much discipline of their old Trotskyist Party cadre organization were they going to maintain. There were lots of us who had hoped that the IWW and not the DSA was going to be the rallying cry, because the IWW had no prior history of working with the Democrats. But we lost out. I mean, we lost out partly because the IWW was kind of poorly run at the national level. So the DSA explodes, but it doesn't truly. I mean, I
think in that moment, people were looking toward direct political involvement specifically as well. Mm-hmm. That was part of that explosion. Was people? I think if it's gonna stick around, it's got to pivot to labor and labor organizing. But that moment was a moment of direct electoral political involvement, and that's why I think DSA was the home of the explosion rather than IWW.
I would agree, and I would actually even go a little bit deeper. Some of the things that are still the structural flaws of DSA are also its ability to house this in ways that other groups weren't. It's very, ironically, very both centralized and confederated simultaneously, so much so that there's not really regional or mid-tier organizational strata to handle things. That's why this whole quasi-sectarian caucus system became so important in the aught teens, because there was really no way to organize the difference between the locals and the nationals, nor was there a clear way to talk about ideological differences and tendencies within the organization, where there was actually in another organization actually born at the same time, another one that I thought maybe would have taken off and for a moment looked like it was going to and didn't, which was the CPUSA. The Mimi Solchek, Mimi died recently, so pour out a little bit of Coke Zero for him. But the Mimi Solchek led CPUSA had multiple tendencies. It came from the same split. I mean, it was the corresponding organization to the DSA. Yeah. But also, it could not drop its... I'm not quite sure, because it's not quite right to say it's sectarian, but they wouldn't get on the Bernie campaign. They actually ran somewhat in opposition to it. I suppose because they refused to work with Democratic electeds. Mm-hmm. So this led to them not being able to really do an insider-outsider strategy. And so they also, I mean, they more or less actually collapse in the Bernie moment. There's a lot of groups that almost seize up to the DSA and fail. That's all deep history now in terms of the left, although, for me, this is all relatively recent history. But yeah. It
doesn't seem that long. And whenever you just said for all the younger listeners, I was like, oh damn, that's right.
Yeah, I know.
I'm getting old.
I mean, that's the funny thing, because for me, it's like, well, I entered the left around 2005 to 2007, and I felt old then.
Yeah,
because I was 27,
you are old for a leftist who's not a senior citizen,
right? Well, I mean, that was the thing. We used to joke about it. You're either 18, and this is in the odds, or you're 70 and you're lecturing us about what you did in SNCC and how you joined a Trotskyist or Marxist-Leninist group, depending on your orientation in the 70s, and then you've just been holding out. And maybe join the DSA because they had a group locally and they met once a week.
Right.
And that was true in a lot of organizations. I mean, the slight exception was the ISO. And from the 90s to the mid-aughts, the ISO grows and collapses too. But
I think it the ISO succeeded in gathering the campus left, and so that it necessarily involved grad students and like adjunct professors, that sort of thing. So I think that's where you saw the middle age group actually appearing in left organization there in that sense. Yeah.
Well, I mean, also when you say the campus left, you mean third campus left, because campus, like
CAMPUS is what I meant, but yes.
Oh, campus. Okay, yeah, but yeah, they did effectively. They came in and grabbed up all the remainders of the campus organization movement. They were the I mean, and your co-hosts come out of this time. They were really the only game in town that was an anarchist in any sense.
That's in fact, that is my radicalization. As I was a young person who I almost dropped out of high school. Went to community college for one semester and flunked out, and delivered pizzas for a few years, and worked some odd jobs. Sat around on the internet, reading things, watching documentaries, reading Howard Zinn, watching Noam Chomsky documentaries, and keeping up with like Democracy Now! And just sitting there being bitter and angry and having absolutely no idea what to do with my life or how to express any of these thoughts or ideas. Eventually, I end up going back to school for my undergraduate. And the second I got to campus, I was looking for the organized student left that I had become familiar with through, histories of the new left and that sort of stuff that I had encountered. And where I went to school, there were two organizations. There was SDS and there was ISO. SDS was where the anarchists hung out, even though nationally on that campus, SDS was a front group for, I think it was Frizzo.
The people don't get, there was this weird anarcho-Maoist thing in the
real super weird, but locally
strange.
the anarchists they housed themselves as SDS, and there wasn't anybody else but anarchists in that, and so I was like, I don't really know what my politics are necessarily, but the Leninists are organized and functional. The anarchists sit around and talk to each other about how everybody should be super radical or whatever. So I hung out with the ISO and got educated as a Marxist because they were the ones who actually got organized.
Probably around the same time for me, I was in Georgia. I'm looking for any left organization, and there at the time were literally none.
Yeah.
Even the DSA didn't even have a chapter in my state, despite Atlanta existing. Like, that was where we were at. And this was particularly in regards to my immediate recognition of, I'm going to say, I think a lot of the narratives of candidate betrayal are greatly overstated, actually. I don't think, for example, Ocasio-Cortez betrayed us. I think we betrayed ourselves in believing in her. I mean, I'm saying we because it was most of my friends. I never did. I didn't trust her. But I don't think I think like there's like a recognition now of mutual opportunism. But I don't think she betrayed us even though she adopted the rhetoric and she wrote that line. But I mean, like, we kind of had to know at some level.
I think so. Here's one of the mistakes that I think even the best of the left continues to make is in trying to make pronouncements about what figures or movements or moments are going to turn into. Everybody sort of like picks a position, a side or whatever, and then pronounces, this is what's going to happen. I'm correct. and then whichever way it sort of comes out, everybody gets to be like, well, see, I was correct, so my theory is the right one or whatever. When I think it is a mistake to engage with political opportunities like that. I think the world is radically contingent, or at least from our perspective, before dusk, before the owl Minerva spreads her wings, everything at least appears contingent, and we must engage with a radically contingent world. And we have to recognize that any given moment is full of possibilities. It is a human body that is full of germs that one or the other may end up killing that person, but to pronounce upon birth which of those germs will be its death, is it's premature. I think we need to recognize the possibilities, good or bad, and engage with a political moment in full awareness of those things. I think even AOC represented a moment that could be useful, could have been. I think it was very obvious. Like, I'm not even super involved. I don't even really know that much. I became aware of her after she got elected. And so, like, as soon as I became aware of her, I was like, oh, wow, that's pretty great for DSA. This is a hell of a moment. DSA really is having a hell of a moment right now. Then it was, as soon as she got into office, I think I had heard that she laid off half of her staff and hired on a bunch of Democratic Party operatives, Justice Democrats and stuff like that. And it was in that moment that I immediately knew, like, okay, I know where this is going. I know which way she's chosen to go with this. She is going to, I think she's earnest. I think she believes herself to be, helping to make more progressive policy and enact more progressive change or whatever, and be the left wing of the possible, like what DSA used to say it wanted to be and all that sort of thing. But the reality is she's made her bed with the leadership of the Democratic Party and will not rock the boat when necessary, such as in moments like this. I think, however, to sort of maybe circle us back around to the original topic of, this is where I see the importance of engaging with the moment and not just pronouncing what is going to happen, which very likely is going to happen. Is DSA is just going to spiral into dissolution, into irrelevance or whatever, but also see the possibilities, see the different germs that exist in it. And I think to continue to relegate ourselves to irrelevance by making pronouncements on the sideline about how AOC and whoever else is a opportunist and betraying the working class, etc. It's like, okay, well, sure, you're right. Sure, you're pure. You haven't been touched or sullied by the sinful impurities, but you're not doing anything. You're not helping anybody. I think, though, that if the DSA could potentially have the possibility to harness this moment to capture a visible and at least tiny bit potent bit of political power and turn itself into something that actually matters and can assert itself against its elected representatives, not against, but over its elected representatives, start to act like a political party, even if its only elected representatives are members of the Democratic Party. The United States political system, party system, is very different, and I may start to sound like the dirty break folks here, but it is a radically different party system in this country than in other countries. And if DSA could organize itself in such a manner that it started to operate like a party and start to assert itself over its electeds in a manner that is well finessed enough It could do. It's a delicate operation, but it could turn itself into something that actually matters instead of just saying, uh, uh, from the beginning, a priori, we won't sully ourselves by being associated with these bad people. The left, the left could really benefit from some serious opportunism. Some people who actually give a shit about winning and putting their hands on power. Yeah, there are dangers in that. Yeah, there are risks in that, and we need to look to the history of the left to learn those lessons and see what we can do to avoid them as we grow and develop and become more influential and actually start to matter in the world. But right now, the dangers of opportunism are not our problem. Those are not our problem. Our problem is absolute and utter impotence, irrelevance. We do not matter.
Mm-hmm.
There are no opportunists around because we don't matter. And the future is not on our side.
Well, that last bit's important. I mean, my point in starting in with the Obama upside, that actually I do think was a betrayal, not of the left actually, but of an anti-war center. Even though I'm also going to say Obama didn't misrepresent his positions. But what made it a betrayal was that he campaigned as an answer to a decaying Democratic establishment and ultimately what he endorsed and re-empowered in a very well. I mean, Obama didn't bring anyone else up with him. I mean, that's the irony of when we talk about Obama Democrats, we're talking about one man. What he endorsed in his coward's way out was to re-empower the old Clinton Atari Democrats going all the way back to Carter establishment. Now, jumping forward to where you're talking about today. I have gotten frustrated with the purity mongers too for somewhat different reasons because, for example, when they talk about Occupy, like, oh, it was doomed to fail. And I was like, well, honestly, anyone involved who was half serious knew it was doomed to fail. Mm-hmm. The thing is, it mattered how it failed. It mattered where it went. And to just shit on it now, to remove it from its process of collective awakening is to actually miss a certain point. And it's easy to do that with the DSA today, which is something that I have struggled with. I'll give you an example. I'll tell you an opportunist that I was supported that everybody loves, and they're not going to like when I call him an opportunist, but he was. And that was Michael Brooks. I learned a lot from Michael because he was an opportunist, because it was a time period where at least I had someone to engage with, and that did have an effect. Mm-hmm. Whereas before it was someone like me going like, oh, who am I going to fucking engage with? Some Obamaite, or even a Justice Democrat. Whereas during the Brooke years, yes, I mean, like I used to tell him to his face, and I'm like, it's going to be interesting the moment when you betray us. But he's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm like, it's not going to even be your fault, dude. Like,
yeah, right?
It's like this is not a personal failing here. Right. But at the same token, we are in a world right now where our options seem to be, and this will bring me to where you and I have an interesting thing about what could happen in this current moment. We're looking at a situation where even what we might call the rad lib left on certain issues internationally, and in some of the dumbest frameworks I can think of, has still arrived at a decent position.
Right.
Like, look, comparing the Israeli-Palestine situation to indigenous situation in the United States is both kind of apt and also very stupid simultaneously.
Right. There's big differences, yeah.
There's big differences, but at the same time, it's such a monumental shift from even where we were a year ago. I mean, like the BDS Commission and the DSA was getting its ass kicked every round, you know, despite the fact that it's one of the few issues where the majority of the DSA, whether you're left, right, or center of the DSA, and I know people like there's a right of the DSA, yes, that's what the squad is, or worse. There is actually worse in there.
Yeah, there is.
A lot of it's in New York and LA, but like this, that's one issue where the majority of youngish people under 40, 35, were united, and it was still getting its ass kicked. Now, there's an irony here, and I talked about this in 2020, that look, you know, during the high point of the 50s, when the CPUSA was truly, you know, being persecuted and dying, although I'm going to say something that's slightly controversial. Yes, the Red Scare is part of that. Yes, it started at the States, but the way that they organized the Popular Front did not help them at all in the 40s and 50s. And by that I meant, like, they did hide their position. So when people were like, "Oh, you were operating secretly in the union movement," they were. They did seem completely incoherent and beholden to USSR's politics, even when it didn't make sense domestically.
Yep, because it was.
Yeah. They did. They also had over-focused on the same kind of things we over-focused on now. I mean, like, a great section of the leadership of the CPUSA in the 40s and 50s have come out of the campus movements. That was new then. I mean, to be fair to them, like, that's after the GI Bill. There's all these formerly working class people entering the universities. Like, it is a kind of a different move than it is today. But it opened them up to being purged in a very real way, particularly when the AFL-CIO combined. But all that aside, like, yeah, they didn't help themselves. But again, if I was a leftist in the 40s, would I have opposed the CPUSA? I have no idea, actually. I don't know. It became easy to do in hindsight in the 60s and 70s, even from the Marxist-Leninist perspective. Like, so to talk about how that's related to now, though, during the 50s, there's two things that happened. One, the CPUSA did basically a de-racialization campaign that was kind of noble, but ended up in the 50s going to what we might call woke purges today. They started going after people off of any inclination of having a chauvinist orientation. And it was not led by black members of the party. Two, the CPUSA started seeing its way to survive was to be the safeguarder of a minority arts movement and whatnot, which was not, you know, if you were a black intellectual coming out of the 1950s, you probably got CPUSA money. In a very real sense. Like, there's like you go through, like, Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin at one point, Richard Wright. Now, all those people eventually break, but that's, you know, there's a real nucleus there, and one that I think is utterly defensible. I mean, it's one of the better things that they did. However, it did make it seem like after they got purged from union leadership, that they just didn't have any relationship to the working class at all. And so during this period is when they start taking very radical positions on foreign policy. But at the same time, doubling down on the Popular Front strategy, right? And one of the things I've always found interesting, and this is where I'm going to give normal nemesis of the show, Seth Ackerman, and nemesis of the show, not because of the dirty break plan, because I just think like Ackerman's like usually kind of economically wrong on everything.
Yeah.
But
well, and I think the worst of the name that the dirty break gets is from people propounding it and then sort of backing away at every opportunity to start enacting it, you know?
Right, exactly. And fair enough. Like that does look bad. The Eric Blancs and the Seth Ackermans of the world do kind of do that.
Exactly.
They're like, what do you mean? We're just about to build our foremost agenda. Why are you saying now's the moment we need to actually do this thing we said we were going to do? But I want to give Ackerman and Blanc credit for this. They are right that the Popular Front strategy was a dead end, partly because it did not recognize the difference between a parliamentary system and the American congressional system. So there was no way to really do an inside-outside strategy from the CPUSA standpoint without just making itself just completely adjunct to a party that was actively hostile to it in the main. Like, so they took more and more radical positions internationally, but they took less and less substantive positions at home. And that was a sign eventually of their irrelevance, which hits in the 60s when you start seeing the new communist movement and all these Maoist. I mean, some of this is because the Sino-Soviet split is happening. You know,
yeah.
There's internal divisions within the Marxist-Leninist movement themselves, trying to deal with the legacy of Stalin. All this happens, and the CPUSA doesn't know how to handle it. And is also getting attacked. I mean, the other thing is it's getting attacked successfully by the right, left and right during this time period. There is a way in which, though, that time period is the analogous time period for us to look at for what's happening right now. Because on one hand, I think we're, like, internationally speaking, I think the DSA is finally taking some stances that I think are defensible. Although there are some things that are going to break his mind, like this current stuff in Guyana between Maduro and, like, I don't know how they're going to handle that. I don't know how anyone's going to handle that. Even I don't have a good line on it because, like listening to Marxist-Leninists in Venezuela say, like, hey, we should be calling for peace, and then Marxist-Leninists in the United States, like, endorsing the Maduro regime. It's just a really weird place to be in. But, and I think a lot of that kind of stuff is coming, and this is where your inclination, like, hey, if you try to call this and just try to, like, gloat on where it is, the easiest call is that it's going to go bad. Which,
right, because that's almost guaranteed you're going to be right.
you know, like, it absolutely true. But what do you, that does not put you in any position, and this is where, you know, I said to you privately, or, well, not totally privately, it was in one of the Discord forums. I thought that your position has really matured because there's a recognition of this, like, yes, it's probably going to go poorly, but if we don't engage at all, or we just sit on the sidelines, we maintain our purity, we maintain looking correct, I guess. But we don't have any grounds to interact, not even with the DSA. I mean, to some degree, I don't so much care about that. But for example, the DSA, for good and ill, has been heavily involved in union bureaucratic struggles. So they've been engaged in the G. McEvery stuff, which I think has overled people to enter unions as staffers. Absolutely. But there has been a real interest in shifting from primarily electoral work to primarily labor work, in a way that the DSA's leadership's own shenanigans around Biden and the railroad strike actually forced people to look at realistically. Now, are we in a moment of labor resurgence? For me, it's hard to say because clearly there's militancy there. Clearly the UAW is actually doing something. Clearly that's where the movement of the left is going to be. However, for the past 2 years, a lot of these same people have basically been making public pronouncements that were just objectively false. Like that unions were growing. They aren't.
Nope.
That there's a real battle in the NCLB. There kind of is, but how much that's actually mattered has been very unclear. That we were seeing a wave of unionization in the service industry. I'm not going to say that's false, but it hasn't produced contracts that have mattered yet. And it's just been a wanting to declare wins.
Yeah. The Amazon Labor Union, of historic, incredible, cannot be understated important. How amazing the one victory was, but has not yet been replicated anywhere else.
Wait, still
one warehouse.
And I put all that into thing to say, I actually think, dialectically speaking, and I know people hate that word because people abuse it, but I'm gonna defend the use of dialectics here.
I'm a fan, so go for it.
I know you are, but my audience is always iffy when I throw the D word around. But in a real sense, like, just as declaring victory too soon is dumb, the tendency for someone like me or some of your co-hosts over at Regrettable Century, and I have actually gotten into some arguments where I've actually told Chris in particular that he's too pessimistic, which is wild. Me calling anyone too pessimistic was not on my bingo card. But we also don't know where this ends yet. Mm-hmm. Like the UAW thing, I did not see. And that's with me following it, and that is with being covered by people who I think are borderline class enemies. Like, I don't necessarily have a super high opinion of the journalistic work of Ryan Grimm, but there was something real going on there. And frankly, historically, if you know the history of the UAW, that is the most top-down shitty union that was not one of the guild unions. Like, right. Its history is bad. A whole lot of its prior leadership is in prison. Like, and it looked for a while, this way to stay relevant was just to go organize TAs, which, I mean, TAs need representation. It's not a bad thing, but that's not a permanent labor base. Like,
and it's an odd fucking direction for the auto workers union to go.
Right. Another thing.
That's not even industrial unionism. That's just, I don't know what that is.
That is temporary worker guild unionism, of which also, if you take the most cynical reading, and I'm going to just explain it, I don't think it's correct in this case, but if you take the most cynical reading, if you're labor leadership, it's great because those TAs are never going to stand in the union long enough to create a union opposition to you. But there, ironically and interestingly, I'm going to give Ryan Grimm credit. I'm going to give some people I normally shit on credit. Ryan was right that there was something going on in the leadership of the UAW from actually, ironically, being one of the worst unions. It created a space for a pushback internally that even more left-wing oriented unions had not been able to do. And as much as I don't love it, because I do admit I get a perverse joy on shitting on the DSA. That I think the DSA's labor bureaucratic run had some effect on that. Now, and that's a good thing because it does seem like right now, if you look at the purview of U.S. left history, we've been focusing on the wokeness wars for 10 years. All right. And yes, identity politics is super annoying. What has become clear in the Biden years is that even amongst members of, let's say, the petty bourgeois of oppressed minority communities like Black, Latin, and Indigenous communities, that is being seen as, in poll after poll, frankly, white people bullshit. Of which some of our members can benefit, but if you're not in a university, it's not really going to help you. Yeah. Like that is where we're at.
Working in HR or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Like, so that
or nonprofits also. which a bunch of the DSA, they become union staffers or work in a nonprofit. That's
I mean,
a ton of it.
which is a traditional pathway that if you look at like something like the DSA, but an actual party in Canada, the NDP, is also something they deal with all the time. And I think that's always going to be a problem. And I think also
we got to figure out how to deal with it.
Union bureaucracy is also going to be a problem. But the fact that in America we're talking about workers' militancy at all, because there was a slight uptick in unionization in 2007, 2008 that was completely unnoticed. And it was in response to the crises of the time. That's why it was unnoticed, because it also happened that while that was going on, the auto unions were crushed, just completely crushed. Then there was another uptick in 2017, 2018, 2019, where these quote PMC, I like to think of teachers as labor aristocrats because I don't really think we're elite, but whatever. I'm going to admit I have a chip in this game. But where we had gotten fed up and had started actually like forcing our unions, kicking and screaming to do stuff. And that is absolutely true, that like, yes, the NEA and the various state EAs and the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, got on board, but it was kicking and screaming. And we made them. And that was another wave of seeming union radicalization that, unfortunately, while it won in the short run, it's lost in the long run, in so much that like no one wants to be a teacher anymore, and the unions aren't really able to continue their growth except in very specific parts of the industrial Midwest, because they're hampered by old union charters that are written before this happened, et cetera. They have not had the ability to keep people in the profession long enough to start rewriting these charters. So I say all that, like, so now we have this moment. So Bernie is electorally what these labor moments are. And for me, the labor moments are ultimately more important than the Bernie moment, but the Bernie moments where it all became obvious that there really was something. And correspondingly, and I hate to give the Platypus Affiliated Society credit for this, the Trump moment was the other place where it was something obvious. It was like the dialectical negation, but yet also where it showed like there is a real internal movement. Now, I'm also going to point out that the great myth of the anti-Trump left was that Trump was somehow significantly worse than any fucking Republican, because if he was, it's only in the last week of his presidency, which is not when they were really on the game. So,
and worse than what I mean. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I've encountered a lot of use of the word accelerationism that sounds it's about like technology and stuff, and I'm not using it in that sense. I'm using it in the sense of like accelerate the contradictions within capitalism. That this is where my accelerationist bent kind of comes out with the whole Trump moment. That was like the worst part of his presidency, worst in some sense, but he certainly helped to accelerate the disintegration of the great Satan that is the U.S. empire, and that doesn't sound like a worse condition for the left to be in.
You and I, this is where you and I have tensions. I think the U.S. empire is probably actually in better shape than you think it is. Like for example, I had an argument recently with someone on Ukraine where I was like, look, I don't think they ever really thought Ukraine was going to win. I think that was all for public consumption. I think they just wanted to fucking stress test Russia, and they succeeded. And now they're going to throw Zelensky under the bus, and all the the people who thought this was a national liberation game are going to have egg on their face, and a whole lot of Democrats are going to have egg on their face. But the military-industrial complex doesn't give a shit about that.
No, and
Uh,
the Democrats aren't really they're not gonna have that on their face. They get to have felt like heroes for a minute and then move on to the next cause du jour and forget about Ukraine,
I
and
mean,
nobody's ever gonna give a shit about it.
and honestly, the next cause du jour is harder for them
Yeah,
because 80% of their base, not 50% of their
yeah,
base,
yeah,
it thinks they're on the wrong side. I mean,
yeah.
like, um,
But an additional benefit of the whole Ukraine thing was making a display for China. I mean, that's the real. I mean, Russia's. The United States doesn't give a shit about Russia. The United States cares about Russia insofar as it is a whipping boy, an example for the rising power that is China.
right. And it also did something. I mean, let's also be quite frank on real geostrategic policy. It wasn't just a symbol. It's fucking accelerated the shattering of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, yeah,
It absolutely did.
yeah.
And
Exactly.
so it did someone was asking me, well, clearly there are people who thought Ukraine could. I'm like, I don't put it past the military industrial complex to have people in it who who drunk their own Kool-Aid.
Oh yeah.
But I don't. In fact, I would maybe even say maybe like most of them did.
Yeah.
But I promise you, there were some people in that who this is what they thought the most likely outcome was. Because the thing I have to say about the U.S. empire that bugs me, and this is something I think the left maybe is kind of beginning to understand. Maybe knock on desk. Is that the center cannot hold, but it holds fine because the military is like the secret king of our fucking society. Like, if you want to see where innovation comes from right now, it's still from the military. You want to see where, like, what part of the U.S. government is. I mean, what's crazy is U.S. imperialism, even on the right, is not popular anymore. And yet, the U.S. military, the bearer of that imperialism, has had only a minor downtick in popularity. It's absolutely bizarre. Yeah. But it tells you where our society actually really is.
Yeah. Well, and beyond just sentiment, I mean, it's popular sentiment. It's structurally embedded in people's lives. It's a good chunk of the absolutely minuscule unionized workforce in the U.S. South are military people who work for military contractors.
Right. The irony, actually, the interesting thing right now is there's been a lot of left pushback on like the poverty draft and all that, which is funny to me because it's like, okay, they're like, oh, there's no poverty draft. I'm like, there was, though. That's actually just stopped recently. And you know what killed it? The drone program. Like, and they're like, oh, well, the military is super right. I'm like, you live in a country that's super white.
Yeah.
Like, yes, in 2051, there'll be a moment where it'll be majority and minority, but there's no minority group by itself that is not. And also, frankly, it seems like whiteness is being able to expand and incorporate Latin people pretty okay.
Oh yeah.
So that hope is on. If you thought that was your way out, good luck on that.
Yeah.
But the military is still actually more of color than the general population, and so it's an interesting dynamic. And it also is like, weirdly, even I trust soldiers more than I trust cops. It's just a thing. But I think right now, here's what I wanted to get to when you were talking about Palestine. You're saying the DSA had this great response to Palestine. And I actually I'm going to give you with some hiccups where they lost some message discipline, mostly because they were dealing with the PSL. They have been able to walk a line that has had both a radical position and yet not really draw, outside of one or two events in New York, a big target on themselves, which is, in the United States today, a political victory that we have not seen. Because while, yes, there is some anti-Semitism right now, there is some left anti-Semitism. I've seen it. It's real. It's very rare. It is not the majority of the things that I come in contact with.
Yeah. I also don't think I don't think it's resulting in anything material.
No, I
where
mean,
it does exist.
like when you see leftists yell at someone for posting a menorah on TikTok, that's stupid, but it doesn't actually like it's not like right wing anti-Semitism, which does tend to kill people.
Exactly. That is exactly the point.
It's just annoying.
Yeah.
Although I will say the interesting thing about right now, is there's been this left focus on Christian Zionists, and yes, there are more Christian Zionists in existence than there are even Jews. But even on the right, that is a declining minority tendency. Like I was actually interviewing someone on the Israel-Palestine conflict from Strange Matters magazine, and one of the things that we noticed is 56% of Republicans don't support us fully backing the Israeli state. Now, some of that anti-Semitism, absolutely, but I don't think I don't think it can all be.
Not all 56%. There's
no.
probably a good, like, I don't know. There's a chunk of it. I don't know how big that chunk is, but self-aware anti-Semitism is it's so small. It's so minuscule.
Right. And so this moment is a moment where we've seen people really grok the situation in Palestine, Israel, and what the current world imperial system means. And I'm going to actually, and it's been good for a lot of things because it's also hurt campus, because like Russia, and by campus I mean SIT, not UP, not US.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But it's also hurt campus in so much that, like, yes, Russia has taken decent-ish positions on Israel. China is still not touching that with a 10-foot pole.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's been very clarifying of like, oh, this multipolar world system theory is not actually as anti imperial as we may have hoped it was. So now we're going to have to really look at it and figure out how do you move it in one way or the other. So I think all that's actually good. I really do think it's good. I think it's good that the DSA can like do something with BDS. Do I think BDS is going to work? I don't know. I am slightly skeptical, not because of the morality of the activism, but because of the nature of the Levantine economy being mostly military exports in a lot of ways. So I don't know if it's harder to have consumer movements affect that. But it is really important that there is clarity on this issue. Clarity for, and you expressed it very well. Like, if we want to talk about the Hamas situation, yes, it is stupid to like endorse Hamas actively. Or in my case, there are leftists who pretend that they can win, and I think that's silly. They don't have an air force, but I do think, in a very real sense, though, Israel internationally, even amongst people who have, it's going to be operating in a world where, despite how valuable they are to the arms industry, and despite the fact I don't see the great powers giving that up, it's going to be a lot harder for people to get into this broad Netanyahu-led coalition in the future. And it's also made certain kinds of contradictions in not just the American left. I mean, like, the SPD, for example, has gone so anti-Dutch that they actually wouldn't deal with Bernie because he was true pro-Palestine, which is absurd. But that is clarifying to the left in Europe to not get their hopes too bent on whatever. I mean, I think the Russia-Ukraine thing kind of did that too. But on these old legacy parties in continental Europe, that they don't really have a clear international stance, and in some ways that they actually seem more pro-NATO than like the US. It's bizarre.
Well, I mean, they benefit from not having to invest in their own military spending. They can retain their tax expenditures, focus on domestic spending, preventing domestic class conflict and labor unrest, while not having to divert funds to their own military spending. They get protected by NATO.
Well, this is one of those things where, like, I hate to say it, but like paleo conservatives have been pointing this out for 20 years, and I've actually been kind of like, well, they're not wrong. Like, Like there's a whole lot of Europe benefits from empire, but doesn't really pay that much for it.
Because of NATO, because of the unipolar hegemonic power, the unipolar international system under the hegemonic power of the United States. It's exactly right. That is exactly right. And the paleo conservatives and aren't much of a movement, but I mean, they're whatever impact they had on politics through the person of Trump, starting to elbowing his way into NATO and saying that other countries need to start paying their own fair share and reducing the contributions from the United States. That's good. That was a good thing.
Well, Trump is an
unalloyed good.
We want to talk about the moment right now. Trump is an interesting figure on that because on one hand, I agree people like Ben Burgess that Trump's anti-war credentials is always overstated. On the other hand, it is still fucking amazing that since Reagan, you had a Republican who was even slightly hesitant to empowering neoconservatives. He did ultimately, John Bolton, and they betrayed him too. But because Trump isn't a paleoconservative. But what always amazed me about I had the unpopular opinion during the Trump years that like it matters kind of downstream that you oppose things that Trump is rhetorically empowering, but like it really kind of doesn't matter that much. And unfortunately, the Biden years have made it clear that if anyone's been paying attention, all those we're not going to normalize Trump. Well, you didn't normalize Trump, but you normalized all his fucking policies.
100% of them. Yep.
Yep,
that's exactly right.
Except for the ones the courts got rid of, like the Muslim ban, etc.
They complicated it slightly and put a couple of barriers in its way, and then permitted it after it was challenged several times.
Like I said, like it's, and yet ultimately it didn't really change that much. I mean, that was my point. There is even someone like Robert Brenner, who I think gave Biden too much credit in his 7 Theses on Biden. I bring this up, but even he's like, yeah, a lot of the stuff that Biden did that we're calling neo-progressivism, which, by the way, what they were wrong at is Biden was going to be able to continue doing it. I'm like, no, he's not. Most of that stuff began under Trump in moments of crisis. That was forced on everybody by crisis. And it was only ever admitted to be temporary. And it was actually somewhat very similar to the insanity in 2007 that people forget about, where like Lindsey Graham was calling, and people forget this because no one wants to deal with it, but like Lindsey Graham was calling for the nationalization of the banks. And we've just erased that from our collective memory.
Hell of a moment.
This is something to think about when we see the way these things move, and we get really, and we know the Democrats in the next year. I can tell you that I think another clarifying thing, and I'm going to pivot to let you talk, is the Democrats are going to play up their anti-left rhetoric more and more. I think that's going to become clear. We're already seeing that with even squad members beginning to distance themselves. Like AOC is not just distancing herself from the DSA; she's distancing herself from the Justice Democrats. So even the progressives are seen as a liability. I think we're going to see calls for unity, all hands on deck, because of Trump Plan 2025 about going against the deep state, and which, like, I can't tell how serious he is about it. And if he is, my very unpopular take is we might be under a military junta anyway. And people are like, what? I'm like, if he actually tries to do that, then you might actually see the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually do something, which is unheard of in the United States. But it's gonna put liberals in a real weird position, because they're gonna be like, we have to do everything to fight fascism, and you're including maybe supporting a military coup. And that, I still think that's in the far-fetched, not likely to happen predictions of the future. I don't think
so. Yeah.
But it's the fact that it's even a conceivable possibility to me is crazy.
That's true. It's more on the table than it would have been prior to Trump. Yeah.
Right. And that would be like, well, you want to see the contradictions get real clear real fast. It's like, okay, you
accelerate the contradictions, baby.
You got your end of democracy, and it's going to come in the guise of protecting democracy from Trump. But all that
and the left will not be in a position. Should that happen, the left will not be in a position to have any impact on where things go or how it develops, or to harness the moment, the revolutionary moment that would be. So I think let's
turn back to you, because we should. Yeah, what do you think? I mean, there's two. I'm going to leave you with pitting the two things. So we have this international stuff. The other thing I think we have to deal with, though, is that there is a sense, and I made Carl Bayer really mad by pointing this out, that like, if you look at who the Republicans are, yes, Republicans have a lot of support in the over $100,000 a year crowd. But if you look at who the Democrats are right now, the Democrats have their most support in the $250,000 to $500,000 a year crowd. So, so in a very literal sense, there is no party in the United States, either by identification or by policy, currently representing U.S. worker interest in a way that, I mean, that's been true the entirety of our history, but in a way that is like the most undeniable that it's been true.
In the most sort of uncomplicated way. Yeah.
Right. So it seems like the two questions that we have to ask ourselves right now is, how do you connect this good moral position and good political positions without any effect? Because we haven't seen this affect politics yet on international stuff. And yeah, like we said, there are areas where this breaks down. Like Maduro in Guyana is going to be one of them. But at least right now, we have clarity on Palestine in the sense that we all agree, or at least 80 to 90% of us, even of like rad libs and normie Democrats, agree that the apartheid's unjustifiable and that at least the military actions need to stop, and we can deal with whatever's happening with Hamas later. And we can't get that position even in the most progressive parts of the Democratic Party. Like, despite the fact that that is almost universally agreed upon in not just the DSA, but like the entire Democratic Party base. 20% of very old boomers disagree with us, but everybody else is pretty much on that. They might have different ideas of what you do after that, but to me, that's a clarifying moment about where power is in the Democratic Party. And then the other thing, though, that I think we have to deal with, and this I don't yet see on the horizon in DSA, is that it has always gotten into this, we're going to move and spread out into these areas where social democratic policies are on paper popular, on poll after poll. They're more popular in red states in some ways than they even are in blue states, frankly. But that we have no traction with those people. And it always seems like in 2016, there was a movement to go out and like run stuff municipally in these areas. But by 2020, we're back into doubling down on New York and LA, and that's really where we're focusing. Do you think that the DSA, or what comes out of the DSA, because I think we both agree, and I know our cosmonaut compatriots are not going to agree with us on this, but I want them to hear it, that like the most likely outcome is that the DSA is either going to shrink and become kind of a sectarian organization that can't survive off the bloat of its dead whale.
Yep.
Or it's going to split. And I'm not predicting which one. Like, I'm not in for reasons like you said, I'm not in the prediction game anymore. One, when I make predictions, they're usually right, but it doesn't do me any good. And two, when they're wrong, they're spectacularly wrong, and I just would rather not have egg on my face by trying to play profit anyway.
Yeah.
So like,
I think that's the right. I think that's the right tack to take, honestly, and I think that what matters is identifying the factors that are feeding into whatever potentialities exist. Identify those factors and maybe suggest which ones you think are weighing more heavily and why. The and why is the most important part, because that tells you what you need to do about it, what you need to do in response. So
what do you think can be done in response? I'm going to cede the last 15 minutes to you without playing the prediction game. What do you think can be done in response?
So here's what I would have to say is that I think that maybe I'll surprise you with this, but I think that you're right in identifying that it is the dwindling of DSA and its increasing irrelevance that is the causative factor in giving rise to the fact that it's able to take more good and correct positions on international politics. And you're not only just right. I don't want to just say that you're right because like, oh yeah, I agreed with that. That's a good point, and I don't think I had actually even considered that. So, but what I would say in response to that is that doesn't actually change my position. I don't care very much that that DSA take the correct nuanced position on pretty much anything. What I care about, what does matter to me, is whether DSA enacts certain positions that have some sort of implication, some sort of material playing out in some manner. So, for example, I don't care if DSA has a sufficiently sophisticated position on Hamas and October 7th and the Palestine question. What I care about is there is a moment that appeared on the on the national stage here where political actors needed to engage on one or the other side of this question, and DSA engaged on the correct side of that question. And it did so in a manner that was more coordinated and concerted than I think it generally has in the past, despite it being significantly larger than any other left-wing organization in the country at this moment in time.
I'm going to surprise you while you're collecting your next thought and agree with you on that and actually say, like, the correct nuance line is something for people to fight within the left. It is not something to fight in larger society.
Right. Exactly.
I do think there has to be some message discipline on am I going to go after even a group that I objectively am skeptical of, like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, because there's some assholes in it who said some stupid things once at a rally. Not publicly, I'm not. Right. And not because I'm scared of them, but because I think ultimately to expect everyone to have the right position coming out.
It's naive.
It's just crazy. And it never happens that way.
Yeah, that's not how the world works. That is not how the world works. I've got some news for you. If you think that we have to have everybody holding the correct position before we can change the world, then if you think that's how the world changes, then buckle in for a long wait until you die, because it's never going to change that way. Yeah. Most people are incredibly stupid and don't understand anything and get everything incredibly wrong. And that's the world that we live and operate in. And if you want to change the world for the better, you use the human material that we have, not the human material that you wish we had.
And I'm going to even add something to that. They're incredibly stupid, and yet they're somehow probably smarter than you. This is my whole weird. I have a dialectic of intelligence where I'm like, most individuals are kind of dumb, And yet somehow collectively, if I was to take, and I'm not even talking about left opinion, if I want to take any position and just poll the entirety of the United States, there is actually some truth that I'm likely to get to a position that's actually probably slightly smarter than mine, despite the fact it's made up of people who at least 50% of, assuming I am dead average, are dumber than me, just statistically. So so I just think like the perfect position is both, it has an unrealistic view of people, but it also has an unrealistic view of yourself. But anyway, to let you go, I just wanted to agree with you on that.
So we're finding surprising common grounds here. So here I think so in given that position that I have about, it doesn't matter about the correct position, it matters about what actions does the organization take, and how does it organize to affect its position when it takes a stand on one side or the other when a moment is presented to it. So I think DSA acted correctly and nobly in response to the Palestinian question when it arose. I don't think that DSA is necessarily going to. I don't think that means that DSA is necessarily going to blossom into this wonderful, thriving home of the left that we all hope and pray and root for. But to return to my original position, I think it's got more of a hope of being that than anything else currently, and I don't know what else to do. So I think I think what the moment in history that we exist in is one where the analysis of capital that Marx rendered was one where the primary contradiction existed domestically between the domestic ruling class and the domestic working class, because it was at the burgeoning beginnings of capitalism. Capitalism. I'm basically a third worldist at this point, and you're about to hear it. But the reality is, after the world wars, capital shifted. It shifted its dynamics to where rising prosperity equally benefited all layers of society domestically, and it did so through imperialism, through extracting resources from the global south and using that to buy off its domestic working classes. That is the world that we lived in up until neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is threatening that stable global order, and so the greatest threat to international proletarian movement is the existence of the U.S. empire by my lights. So that is the most important thing for any of us to do anything about. That said, I don't know what we can do about it, really. So, for example, whether DSA should have a perfectly nuanced and correct position on Maduro versus Guyana, as you said, I don't even know what the correct position necessarily is, but I do know the correct stance that has a material impact on the world for U.S. Socialists to take is to oppose U.S. meddling in Venezuela. U.S. should get the fuck out of it. Our position should be always revolutionary defeatism. If we can find a way to plant ourselves in the domestic working class as neoliberalism continues to rise, despite its all the declarations that it's dead, then we will increasingly find ourselves in a position where the primary contradictions have returned to the conflict between the domestic working class and the domestic capitalist class, while we work to undermine the hegemony of the U.S. empire from within. I can't speak to what position, what more, nuanced positions socialists in other countries, other parts of the world might need to take because they're not within the U.S. empire. But we've got a very simple position. That is, we advocate for the defeat of the great Satan, the U.S. empire.
Yeah,
and I think the only way to act that out is we've seen DSA acting nobly among its membership, but not acting out any form of discipline on its elected representatives in Congress, who are
what
not.
power does it have to do so?
It doesn't. It doesn't at this point. But if DSA is going to be something worth, being a part of, it will move to position itself such that it is capable of asserting discipline over its elected representatives who actually have seats in office, whether in Congress or elsewhere. And I see here, this is where I am a big advocate for Cosmonaut as the. It's not, they don't call themselves Cosmonaut, Marxist Unity group. Yeah, I'm a big advocate for them because I think they're the group that is most well positioned within DSA to affect this, which is to gradually move DSA into this position without doing it in such a manner that it is such an internal shock to the organization that it just sheds all of its membership and all of the right wing of the organization, and any attempt to assert control over electeds is just met with those electeds, leaving the organization saying, "Fuck you, I don't need you anyway."
Which is currently happening.
That has happened with some of the worst members that never should have been endorsed by DSA in the first place and didn't have any involvement from DSA in the first place. These are people who were just bog standard progressives, and their local decided to endorse them or whatever. AOC might be the exception, but she hasn't left DSA. It's in response to the Palestine question, where she is facing incredible pressure from the leadership of the Democratic Party in Washington, in DC, to distance herself from DSA and the wider base on this question. She's started to say some critical things about DSA. We'll see what happens. And I'm not saying that anybody I can predict one way or the other what will or will not happen. But I do see the possibility of people coming into leadership in DSA and handling this very delicate situation with appropriate delicacy, to move it in a positive direction, to finesse it in such a way that it can begin to assert control over its electeds without shedding whatever membership that it does have. So it moves itself into a position where it starts mattering that you're a member of DSA, which I would hope would move it in a direction of actually starting to increase its membership again, and also it's mattering in the sense that it's not just giving more money to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but it's mattering in the sense of actually starting to form the basis of a working class political party in the United States.
Well, you said a lot there at the end, and I am going to address it with one statement. You manifest the world spirit of the left right now, and we'll see how that goes. But in some sense, you and I would argue to the cows come home about what actually happened from 1950 to 1970 and from 1970 to 1990. I think that there is both agreement in some of the statements of fact and disagreement on both how it happened and what it represented. I can almost promise you that. We probably also have a different view on what electedness is possible in the near future. But where I would say that I would agree with you is 2 points. One, the post-war social compact is over. It was dependent on imperialism. How that imperialism worked, that's a different matter, but we're not getting into that here. Two, neoliberalism, weirdly, this is where I feel like third world just fell down on the game of analysis. And not because they were wrong about, well, I mean, I think they're wrong about the mechanism, but that's why they fell down on analysis. But they weren't wrong about, like, hey, the seemingly shift has moved outside of the course of capital. The issue that I would say that I would have with that is like, well, interestingly, neoliberalism correlines with the actual moment of uniparality because unless you're a Maoist, you don't actually believe, like an old Maoist from the 60s, you don't actually believe that the USSR and the US were on the same side in 1960 to 1970, which third worldists actually did. So to bring out some of the contradictions in that historical movement. All that said, though, right now, I mean, for me, it's important to oppose the U.S. empire. I don't know that I have that's the only thing we need to oppose, or if I think it's the primary thing we need to oppose. But I agree with you that, for example, there'll be, as long as, ironically, the popularity of stuff like MMT, which, is correct for imperial powers, but as long as you're pro-imperial to support those programs, and why they are imperials, you have to have the ability to leverage the U.S. dollar with nothing backing it, over other countries for that to work.
Yeah, except it's military, which is why it works.
Which work. There's a reason why, like, it's the English-speaking countries and the few countries that got integrated into, like Japan, that got integrated into the American world systems where you can do that. Like, I think we have to get beyond those dreams, and those were easy answers that I think also are over. And the other thing I would agree with, while I don't necessarily, I have a more conflicted view of Cosmonaut than you do, and the Marxist Unity Group. But where I think that in the United States is not this different from Imperial Germany under Prussia in one key way. A Marxist party that would emerge should not be interested in being a coalition running our bourgeois government in its empire. In so much that we could ever be elected, we actually would have to learn from the fucking right, and just be like, we're abstentionists. We're abstentionists for the working class, as opposed to for, like, petite bourgeois interest, which is what the right really kind of represents. But we're abstentionists. We're here to fuck you up and to help labor, and that's all we're doing. Like, electorally, we'll do other stuff, but like that's got to be our electoral mission, because we don't want to end up being the party that has to, like, manage capitalism from a left perspective, because that's not going to go well for us. We're gonna hit walls. We're gonna be undermined by the donor class. Like, and we just should be realistic about whatever role we're gonna have. Is basically just to, I mean, like, I hate to say it, but like, we are electing people. The reason to run elected as a socialist party is to prove that we have popular support and to fuck shit up. That's really the only reason to do it. Like, we're not going to get a positive program through, and it became very clear to me that was even the case on reforms that would be good for capitalists, even. Like, so for example, Medicare for all would save capital money.
Oh yeah.
It would just fuck up one sector of a bloated, dare I say, parasitic sector of the bourgeoisie that is parasiting not just in the working classes, parasiting other elements of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, exactly.
We can't even do that.
Well, yeah. Well, we couldn't do that. The U.S. empire is so decadent.
Mm-hmm.
It is so decayed at this point that it couldn't do that for itself. And so, there are international credit rating systems that recently downgraded the United States as a creditor, not because of its fiduciary incapacity or incapability to make payments on debts, solely because of its political inability to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
This is a recognition that the United States political system is decayed. It is decadent, so decadent that it is not capable of doing the things that are in capital's own interest. As much as it used to be able to. That said, the United States is still a very highly rated, creditor on the international stage. But
we used
this
to
was
be
a
literally
unique
the gold standard.
Exactly. Yeah, the international credit rating systems downgrading the United States below some global corporations, like Microsoft is a higher rated creditor than the United States government. So this is the position that we're in. Is we are no, we are not at the moments where Rome is being invaded by the Goths and burning, but yes, we are at the beginning stages of a decaying empire, and our role as Marxists is to insert ourselves into the acceleration of that decay as much as possible, in my opinion.
There are some caveats I would have. That I agree with you that revolutionary defeatism is part of our car. Although I would also say that revolutionary defeatism, historically speaking, also says you don't endorse any other hegemonic powers ever.
Sure.
That is the classical position.
Yeah. Sure. So, but this returns me to the thing that I think we agree on earlier, which is that I don't care if people have a sophisticated or nuanced, sufficiently sophisticated position on these things. What matters is where do you come down in actions, in material terms.
Here's where I think there might be a slight difference between us. I care if you're leadership. I do not care if you're some asshole at a protest.
It does matter. Revolutionary. You're right. I'm overstating my case here, but yes, no, I don't want to undersell the importance of revolutionary theory, of having a correct understanding analysis of things and actually having a correct position ultimately. But I think these things matter less than we oftentimes like to think they do.
Well, I mean, even in the case of revolutionary defeatism, in the case of Lenin got lucky that both Germany and Russia lost.
Yeah,
like in a real sense, because if he had taken the revolutionary position and Germany had still won, that may actually have condemned revolutionary defeatism as strategy for all of history. And so in some cases, the reason I bring that up is not to discredit anything. It's actually to say some of this is beyond anyone's control. Mm-hmm. But I do think there's a tendency right now on the left, and whenever someone says on the left now, I'm sort of that makes my hackles go up, because I'm who are you talking about?
Yeah,
but to find the asshole on Twitter mm-hmm. are. Even where somebody who in general has a good position says something fucking stupid.
Sure.
And focus in on that. And my pace is always you should talk to those people, but you should not go and make a whole fucking podcast series about how the left is stupid off of what is likely to be some 20-year-old's first encounter of politics and saying something inopportune, are accidentally ethnocentrist, or maybe even sincerely ethnocentrist, but it's one person.
Right.
That shit drives so much of left media.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I don't know what it helps. Like, I don't even know that
Yeah.
it helps our enemies. I don't know that it helps anything. Like, it's just
Yeah.
like, it's just
Just
like,
just people spinning their wheels, man. I think
right,
that
exactly.
probably the optimism that you see in me, I think I would identify where that comes from, is the fact that I've kind of given up on creating my own personal identity out of being on the left. That being a communist and being an informed and well-read Marxist who understands theory or whatever is a part of who I am. But I've shifted myself to the point, disabused myself of the idea that it fucking matters at all whether I do X or Y, whether I think, A, B, or C. It doesn't matter. I instead need to recognize that this is the one life that I have, the one life that I have to live. So I'm just going to make the most of it while I'm here. And if I'm so lucky as to live through an important historical moment and partake in that history, I will be very delighted. But otherwise, the only thing that's left to me is to try to contribute to the building blocks of something that might matter in the future. And otherwise, I just live my life. And that makes me a lot less worried about all the internecine bullshit on the left. And it just doesn't
Absolutely.
get to me so much. I don't care. It doesn't matter.
This is actually, you said this on year 5, to go back to why I had you on, and I was like, no, this is the beginnings of wisdom. Whether or not we agree on everything, because for me too, and I don't talk about this as much, but giving up the idea that I was going, when people are like, oh, why don't you have Varnism? I'm like, for one thing, like, I don't want to be another fucking guru, because the last thing we fucking need is another fucking guru. But the other thing is, like, why had they mattered? Like even the people who like go on these anti-guru crusades on the left, I'm like, have you changed anything by doing that? Like, did it change any part of the world?
Yeah.
Did you even get rid of the guru that you were so worried about? Did it? No. I mean, and some, I guess, like, my dialectic now is a dialectic between touch grass and also still being engaged in the world, because I do think we have that responsibility, but I also think, like, at another way, like, if your entire identity is being a left-wing political actor, that's really just a manifestation of your own alienation, and
Yep.
it's not
Exactly right.
gonna help you. It's not gonna
Yep.
help you, and it's
Or the
definitely not gonna
world.
help the world spirit advance to socialism or what the fuck ever. Like, that's like it. Like, you got to get over yourself, and that's and I think for me, it's also just like, that was why, for whatever disagreements we have, we do agree on certain things. Like, participate in it. You know, like, invest in these moments. Don't totally sit on the sidelines. Like, there's a reason, like, for every little bit. Yes, I like this version of the DSA. If they do an action here, even though I'm not giving them money right now, particularly in my, but if they do an action here, I'm likely to engage. If a group that I, like I said, that I am very skeptical of does an action here, if it's something that I care about,
Mm-hmm.
I might be out on the ground with them, and not just to be like, oh, look at these dirty opportunists. No, it's like, actually, even if I really disagree with these groups, if I have to prove that I care about the same shit, that I think it matters, but also not so much that it's my entire identity and that's all that I do, because I
Yeah.
don't know. I think that's personally destructive, even of quote pro revolutionaries.
It's destructive of your own personal well-being as an individual. It's destructive of what possibilities you could create out of the left. I think it makes for bad people, non-virtuous individuals, and non-virtuous individuals constituting the left is, just it's that it's one of our main problems is the left consists of the left doesn't matter. It is irrelevant, and so it concentrates people who are attracted to embracing their own marginality, their own irrelevance, their own alienation from society. It is a concentration of people who reject society and define themselves in opposition to it, rather than what it needs to be, which is an expression of the ambitions and the self-awareness of the broad masses of the world. And we can never get to that point unless the self-organized, self-aware left is constituted people who are leaders in their community, who are well respected and well integrated in their neighborhoods and their workplaces, not people who are the weird freaks that everybody hates and doesn't want to be around, you know? But
yep. I used to think about this, and this I think that's a great point to end on. I just always thought, like, we have to get beyond the normie, not normie dialectic. That if we're integrated in a community, we know that we're going to have weirdos, but they're not.
Oh, yeah.
And some of them might be important, but like,
oh yeah,
for the most part, that's not all we're going to attract. And right now,
man, go to any workplace in any neighborhood, and you will.
oh yeah,
there are weird people. There are dumb people. There are weird people. The world is made up of them. But the thing that we need to do is not to organize the weirdest and most, make ourselves a body constituted in nothing but the
only those
dumbest people. Yeah,
like absolutely. And I think that's a great note to end on, because I think, like, if anything, that's where you and I agree, is that a vibrant left in America that was relevant would have, I mean, one, there'd be tons of disputes, even if we had even if we consolidate around the right questions and we agree on certain things, figuring out how to dismantle U.S. empire, empowering the working class, obstructing certain kind of functions that help the bourgeoisie, etc. That even if we did all that and had unity on that, 90% of the stuff that the left does, we'd still fight over. And that's not, and I've always actually said, we just need to accept that that's not bad, because rightists and centrists and liberals do that too. It's not, that's one of the things that's not unique to us. If anything's unique, is we complain about it and then try to stomp it out in really dumb ways that actually accelerate the problem.
right. Right. I agree.
And that moral purity, weirdly, and I say moral purity here, weirdly doesn't breed moral people. Like,
yeah.
And I do, like, my politics is somewhat amoral. Like, I don't take political positions based on my morality, but I do actually think the left as a subject should care that we have people that, not on sexual issues, which I just frankly don't give a shit about in a lot of ways, like, but on, like, how we treat each other, who we're willing to attack, how we're willing to attack them, what we're willing to do to each other.
Yeah.
And even to some enemies who we could incorporate once we defeated them. Like that really does matter, that you have moral subjects, or virtue. I'm not going to say moral, virtuous subjects who are more interested in living lives that are compatible with other people and having good relations in that area, than with, like, abstract ideas that really are manifestations of their inability to maintain relations at all. And that's a super important thing to end on. So thank you. The weirdest thing about, and I say this all the time, because the longer I do left-wing podcasts, the more this strikes me as weird. I have to do the plug thing where I'm like, well, we're all petit bourgeois rentiers now, and I just want to call attention to it, because, like, people should think about that when they get overinvested in podcasts. But where can people find your work, Kevin?
I'm on Regrettable Century. Wherever you listen to your podcast, check that out. Otherwise, I'm not. I'm a petit bourgeois, affected individual who's just does this as a hobby. So I'm not producing a whole lot of work otherwise. But yeah.
And that is why you're a good person to have on. All right. And on that note, see you later.